Happy Monday. So today we're still working on our progressives. We're still focusing on our big question of how can individuals create change in their context. Last week we focused on how can you create change in your context. This week we're going back to the past, focusing on the time period about 1890 to 1910. And we're going to start by looking at how did reformers work to make society safer for students, citizens. You're citizens. So society is how people live. Social is your attitudes, your customs, your living environment. So today we're going to double check your vocab matching what you've done, take some class notes, and then I'm going to put you to work. Homework. I don't have anything specific from social studies other than your research has to be 100% done for ELA. So if you're missing anything, if you realize while you're in ELA today and you're doing your planning page that you're short on content or facts, use your social studies homework time tonight to take care of that. Let's look at your warm-up and just double check your answers. Fix anything you have that is wrong. If you need longer, pause it and then get going when you're ready. Okay, so our notes. The progressives, that's what we call this group of people who were all reformers. So you've read about, maybe a week and a half ago, at least 3 of them. Some of you read about John Muir, Jacob Riis, Lewis Hines, Ida Tarbell. They all get lumped together under this big title, progressives. So who is this group? Well, things they have in common. They all believed in the basic goodness of people. So even though they could look out at the nation and they could say, oh my gosh, this is a problem, and this is a problem, and this is a problem, they did believe that at their heart, people were good, and if given the opportunity, they would do the right thing. Now, most of these progressives were middle class. That means they're not the super rich like Carnegie and Rockefeller, and they're not the poor living in the tenements and working in the sweatshops. There's a reason for this. See, the really rich were doing great. They didn't see the need for anything to change because they were benefiting. The poor living in the tenements and working in the sweatshops, they desperately wanted things to change, but they didn't have the time. Their life was devoted to survival, working enough that they could buy food, working enough that they could pay their rent. The middle class, this group was pretty unique. They were comfortable enough that they could afford education. So their children went through elementary school, their children did some sort of high school or finishing school, there's some college education there. These are families of like lawyers and doctors and merchants and store owners and things of that nature. And because they have the education, because they have some extra cash, what they can do is they can afford some of these new inventions that are making life easier. So they can afford a vacuum cleaner. They can afford a refrigerator. They can afford a stove. Those new inventions, which means they also now have some free time. And they're also very aware that if something were to go wrong in their lives, they could end up poor, that they weren't that far from living in a tenement. So these are people who are going to have the time and the interest to change the country, to improve it for everyone. What do they want to improve? Well, they want to reform the nation, we said. 4 different categories, or 4 different types of reform people we're looking for. Social. How are people living? What is the housing, the living conditions, the food conditions, possibly the working conditions? Economic. Over here, the buying, the selling, the trade. How are companies acting? Are monopolies, are trusts fair? Political. Are the elected officials actually working for the people? Are they doing what they're supposed to be? Or are the elected officials corrupt and lying and cheating and stealing? And unfortunately in 1900, not all, but quite a few of the elected officials were corrupt and were doing illegal things. And it was pretty questionable how people got elected to certain offices. And so the progressives are going to look at issues of voter rights and how to make government more honest. And finally, the movement to preserve the environment begins with John Muir during this time period. So let's take some notes. Who's their leader? All right, everybody agrees that this progressive movement is made up of lots of different people. We've talked about 4 reformers already. Today you'll learn about another one in a little bit. But those are what we call grassroots reformers. They are individual people making change in their area. What brings this to a national movement is when Theodore Roosevelt, he's sometimes called Teddy Roosevelt or TR, when Teddy Roosevelt becomes president. Now, Teddy Roosevelt initially is kind of what we call an accidental president. Nobody planned on him being president. Originally, he was governor of New York. And as governor of New York, he focuses in on the cigar industry. And what he's really looking at is this issue of piecework being done in tenements. So if we look at this picture really quick, right, we see this is piecework. It's not cigars. They're actually cleaning nuts out of their shells and putting them in this bowl right here. But what happens is this family is working all day. You see the little kids are at the table too. They're working all day to make perhaps pennies because they're going to get paid by the pound or by the bucketful of how many nuts that they clean. And one of the things that becomes really questionable is this family getting paid adequately? Are their wages fair for the amount of work they've put in? But let's also talk about safety for the consumer. Look at how dirty this apartment is. And if piecework, if food and things like cigars are taking place in people's homes, there's no way to regulate or control the production to make sure that it's safe for people. So Teddy Roosevelt works to reform those types of industries as governor. He also works to improve those living conditions, stop corruption, make government more honest. And one of his big things is he wants to make sure that if you get a government job, you're qualified for that job. And it's not just that you got the job because your best friend was elected and hired you to make sure you got a good paycheck. So as governor of New York, Teddy Roosevelt was making huge waves and huge amounts of reforms. And quite honestly, he was making people in New York uncomfortable. And they wanted him to stop because the rich didn't like these reforms. These reforms were threatening their profit margins. They were costing them money. They were making them do things differently. And they wanted to silence Teddy Roosevelt. They wanted him to stop. Well, now nobody is planning an assassination. I know you. That's where you were going in your head. But instead, what they do, and this is going to sound strange, they give him a promotion. They ask him to run for vice president in 1900. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, if he was causing trouble and doing tons of reform as governor of New York, couldn't he do even more as vice president of the United States? Well, actually, no. According to the Constitution, the vice president only has 2 official jobs. 1, vote if there's a tie in the Senate. And 2, be ready to step up as president if the president dies. Otherwise, the vice president doesn't get to do anything unless the president tells him to. Well, in 1900, Teddy Roosevelt said, sure, I'll run for vice president. And the person he was running with was William McKinley. McKinley was elected as president. Right here, McKinley. I don't have a picture of him, sorry. But then what happens is in 1901, Teddy becomes president because McKinley was assassinated. McKinley was killed in Buffalo, New York. So all of a sudden, this reformer who the political parties had tried to quiet down and the rich had tried to quiet down because they didn't want to make all these changes, becomes the most powerful person in the United States. And what does he do? Well, he makes reform the main domestic policy of the nation. He is going to focus on all domestic policy reform. Foreign policy dealing with other countries, he's really going to be interested in conquering and getting colonies, but that's actually the next unit. So he calls his domestic policy the square deal. See our beautiful square? A square has 4 equal sides. Fairness. Everything is fair, everything is equal. And he would label those sides the producers, the consumers, the workers, and the environment. So companies, people buying things from companies, the workers, and the environment should all be treated equally and fairly by government. And he says to do this, government has to regulate, make rules for businesses. We haven't seen a lot of this for the good of everyone. So Teddy Roosevelt's square deal means the end of laissez-faire. Government is now going to start interfering. And to control those regulations, he develops the Department of Commerce, another cabinet position in the executive branch. Now, he's not our only progressive president. He serves 8 years, and then he tells the public, hey, I think you should elect my buddy William Taft. He's going to make a great progressive reform president. And William Taft serves for 4 years. And then, honestly, Teddy Roosevelt doesn't like how William Taft did the job. And so Teddy Roosevelt's going to challenge Taft for the job, and Teddy's going to try and run for a 3rd term. Now, there's so much conflict between William Taft and Teddy Roosevelt that neither of them win. And Woodrow Wilson sneaks in with the win. He's going to serve 8 years. He's also a progressive president. But during his presidency, the progressive era, this focus on domestic reform is going to end because in 1917, the United States is going to enter World War I. And at that point, we're going to be so focused on fighting and winning the war that we are going to kind of let slide this idea of reform until a little bit later in our history. So from here, I want you to finish the rest of the packet. And you're going to focus on progressive reforms. How do we make society safer for people? By looking at the quality of the food and how they improve the quality of the food. Now, I have a feeling I'm really going to gross you out with some of these things, and I'm really going to shock you with some of these things. So make sure you really focus on the details. All of the slides are posted in Google Classroom, and the title of the slideshow is Classwork Quality of Food. Slide 2, and that's what your notes say. See? Slide 2. Okay. Slide 2, click on the image of the book to read along with the audio. So what I did was I typed up the text of this book, and then I read it to you because otherwise I think the reading could be difficult. So this is the name of the book. This is the author. Look to see what he has to say about what the food and especially the meat was like in 1900. And then I have some other documents here for you to look at, and they all match your worksheet. It is essential, absolutely, positively important that you get slide 7 done. You have to know these 2 laws. Okay? If you finish early, work on your MYP project. Make sure that it's all ready for English. Remember, you are working silently, you are working individually, and you are so well behaved and so focused that the substitute should never learn your name. Have a great day. I will be back on Tuesday.